Hey everyone, Anders Sundquist here, host of the podcast Lean In, and excited for everyone tuning into our audience today. We're going to unpack a very in vogue topic. It's in demand and little understood, which is contingent workforce. So that might mean payroll and EOR or staffing contractors to you. There's a variety of synonyms in this space, and companies big and small use contingent workers. So we're going to unpack this today with my friend Patrick Hartwell. But first, want to shout out to our sponsor, Juicebox AI, and introducing People GPT, which is an AI search engine that understands who you're looking for so you can discover and unlock talent density at scale. So thank you, Juicebox. So with me today, I have Patrick Hartwell, and it's so funny. Our paths have crossed over a decade ago at Aerotech, and here you are, Patrick, the head of contingent workforce. And I'm very grateful for you joining the Lean In podcast today to unpack this topic of what contingent workforce is, what your role as the head of CW includes, and these trends in the industry today, because it's certainly fluctuating very quickly in this dynamic market. So why don't you fill us in on what your role is, and more importantly, what's been your journey into head of contingent workers?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for having me. I'm definitely glad to be on. It has been an exciting journey, been in the space for, coming up on what, 14 years now.
Time has flown by
Yeah,
since
the
our
time
20s.
flies,
Yeah,
right? So I will try and keep that 14 years as concise as possible.
great.
But like a lot of folks in this space, and like you alluded to, I started back out in 2011 actually as an agency recruiter in the Bay Area. For the most part, my focus was on MSP managed programs in the biotech space. And honestly, early on, I recognized what a real mess some of those were at the time.
Oh yeah.
I mean, next to zero details on any rec, no real connection between recruiters and the client. A subpar candidate experience at times, and transparently, it's no secret that I was certainly not a biotech expert when I got into this. And I wasn't really well networked in the biotech talent community, and that wasn't doing my clients any favors. And I came to realize over time that this was sort of the norm for a lot of agencies. So fast forward a year, I found myself up here in Seattle, where I'm at now, to support the consumer tech space for the first time. And I really went into a different focus with it, just sort of trying to figure out ways that I can do it better. Really just trying to improve the overall process as best as I could from the bounds of my recruiter chair, of course, and trying to find ways to become more connected with my clients. At this point, though, I start to realize maybe recruiting isn't for me. And I really wanted to be on the MSP side, kind of focusing on operations, but with the goal of building just an overall better flow than I had experienced myself in the past. So thankfully, I was able to make that transition to an MSP, still supporting many of the same clients, but, with the ability to really impact how we operate and how clients engage with suppliers. In that role, I ended up moving up the ladder in that space over the course of 5 or 6 years, eventually running my own programs. And it wasn't until 2020 that I made the move over to what we had at the time referred to the client side of the house, where I find myself today. And really, really grateful and really happy to be in this space. Obviously, still very much in consumer tech. Yeah, and it's a good spot to be in.
Thank you for the context, and certainly quite a career trajectory. And so, what I want to start with is, and not everyone might understand some of the words we're using here. There's sometimes synonyms, and I want to set the stage for everyone before we dive into what your role is as head of contingent, and really what a program means. And so, break it down. So, what is contingent workforce program? You just mentioned MSP, and what are these suppliers you're talking about?
Absolutely, yeah. So, your contingent workforce program for most companies in this space, I'd say it primarily focuses on staff augmentation. So those kind of, role-based assignments where you've got FTEs overseeing somebody directly. And when I refer to the supply base, it's typically the group of staffing agencies that supply that talent up through the MSP as sort of that filter. And MSP, of course, managed service provider. All the acronyms in this space, sometimes it's easy to
BMS, MSP.
Yes,
Totally.
exactly. Throughout, as we're sort of conversing today, I'll use the term sort of staff aug to refer to that space, or I'll use outsourcing vendors to talk a little bit more about what we see kind of in on that side of the house. Does that kind of answer the question?
That's perfect. And if you're tuning in today and you're learning some of this language, no one better to learn it from than Patrick. He's run contingent workforce at some of the largest FANG and tech companies, but almost every company, big and small, uses contingent workers of some type. And so if you're a people or talent leader, at a startup, and you're tuning in to the Lean In podcast today, there's much to learn here about how you might design a program or even use contingent workers to solve some of your problems with staffing. And there's a variety of reasons and levers to pull here. And so sometimes even the word temp is used, or a contractor, and maybe sometimes the vendor is identifying as an RPO or an embedded talent solution or a staffing agency. These can all be synonyms as well. So just kind of putting that plug in for other language that is used in this space. And to kind of set the stage a bit on my background is I've always typically been on the vendor side of things. And so I deeply understand what it means to be a third party or a vendor or in the staffing agency side of things. And I've been at companies big and small and founded and run my own staffing agencies. So I do have some awareness there of the language, and it really helps to align on that. And okay, great. So we know what contingent workers are. We've set the stage on what a program kind of looks like. And so tell us a bit about what you're responsible for, and even more so, what you're optimizing for this year in contingent workforce, because CW programs have changed a lot the past couple of years.
Absolutely. Well, I'll caution you, this may be a little bit of a mouthful. I'll try and, like I said, keep it as concise as possible. But to your point, right, like the contingent workforce is so critical to any operation, sometimes half of the overall workforce that's supplying projects and support. So definitely a tall order in terms of what's involved with the role. So to that point, I'm operating in quite a few lanes, to be honest. So for one, I'm responsible, of course, for overseeing our MSP relationship that I alluded to earlier, and really just ensuring they're raising the bar of service as often as possible and really delivering a consultative experience to the business rather than the more transactional approach a lot of MSPs might be more used to. Then, of course, I stay really close with managing our staffing suppliers to a standard that primarily emphasizes the quality of their sourcing efforts. And I don't just mean whether they're filling recs, but looking at how many candidates did it take them to do that? What is the submittal to interview ratio? And other metrics that kind of fall into that pattern. And these are certainly not new metrics by any means. This is not revolutionary, but I weigh them perhaps a little heavier than most, since they directly tie into driving confidence in the program and the manager's ability to trust that the supply base knows what they're looking for. So it really goes beyond the simple, did they fill the rec or not, if that makes sense. And then, of course, all of this is still very much in addition to the cost component, which is sort of equally front and center. Specific to optimization and kind of keeping that supply base in that sweet spot, the main balance I look to achieve is having enough of the right agencies to support the rec volume coming out of each business unit, but running lean enough such that each agency is only up against a few others competing for that business, and that they are aware of that, right?
Yeah.
I find this really
And
helps.
They always want to be aware of that.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
I find this really helps keep them engaged, helps to really combat, and I had this at the time too, this sort of anti-MSP black hole stigma that often comes with these programs. So trying to really, cross that bridge, get rid of some of those old perceptions and really demonstrate that an MSP can be still a competitive environment for agency recruiters.
Thank you. And I want to double click quickly before your next thought. You mentioned a couple stats. I want to unpack a little bit more about. You said sometimes contingent workforce can be as much as 50%. When I'm talking to TA leaders or people leaders at let's say a public tech company, I often hear that they actually build or design a headcount plan such that around, let's use a wide ballpark, 20 to 40% of workers are contingent workers by design. So they have some flexibility in headcount to scale up and down with the economy's fluctuations. Mm-hmm. Does that resonate? How does that match with what you've seen in your roles?
It does. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you think about the highest volume areas, and I'm just going to share a few examples, but like, for example, any tech company that is global, that is all across the world, they've got functions that are not in-house to what they do, right? So you think about the people that are serving food, the janitorial staff, you think maybe projects or special research areas in the more technical spaces that are, again, it just not part of what the expertise that is generally in-house at one of those given companies. More creative roles where maybe they only need that work at certain times. So yeah, by design, it makes perfect sense you're going to know that you're not going to invest long-term in hiring those folks as FTEs and granting all the equity and benefits that come with that, when either a third-party expert can do it better or for cheaper, or you need the flexibility, like I said, to only be able to leverage that talent at certain times. So it definitely is by design and makes a lot of sense. The other thing too is, especially at the risk of going on a tangent here, but especially with all the uncertainty that we see in the market, you don't always know whether you're going to get FTE headcount. And so saying, hey, let's just move forward with contractors, that really fills a more immediate gap. And, I see a lot more of folks kind of bringing on contractors with the goal of, hey, maybe I can convert this person down
Yeah.
the road, depending on how we brought them in. So
Yeah, and there's a phrase, some phrases there, just so folks tuning in maybe have been a contractor and want to understand why. There's a phrase, try before you buy, for both sides. So the contractor can learn what it's like inside before they might consider an FTE role. And so that the employer or the company, who's actually not the legal employer sometimes, can see if that candidate aligns with their expectations from a KPI, SLA, delivery, and culture perspective. So it can be a great way to get your foot in the door from both sides. And so one of the spaces I wanted to touch on too, if you're tuning in, the audience is largely people and talent leaders and their direct reports here. So the people and talent space has seen wild fluctuations in demand over the past, few years. And I'm sure you can speak to this. When we look at, the talent space today, specifically like recruiters, sourcers, RCs, we're seeing a spike in contract roles, whether that's EOR and payroll directly with the organization or through a vendor or staffed by a vendor. Maybe there's a specialist machine learning sourcer or what have you. Can you tell us a bit about, why we're seeing that today, perhaps?
yeah, and I think I want to allude to a point that I was going to make earlier, which is just, the evolution of the past few years. A lot of teams are just much more dialed into where they can partner with agencies to deliver top talent who really know their space. And of course, which of those can do it within the budget parameters that we lay out. This is different from what we used to hear a lot more in the past, which is just, I need people in the door yesterday, just send me resumes, and I'll sort out the rest, with less of a focus on cost for the most part, and just more like sort of what we used to say, butts and seats, so to speak, which just really isn't the case today, and speaks to what we see happening in the job market compared to 21 or 22, where now you have a lot more competition for fewer roles, both on the contracting and FTE side. Now, you mentioned EOR. This ties very much into the theme that we've been discussing around lack of trust in sort of yesterday's staffing providers and this desire to really find quality talent.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I think a lot of MSP programs haven't been as quick to catch up to what's happening in the market and haven't been as proactive in sort of shaking up their supply base. So we find managers who eventually become disgruntled and decide they're going to search their own professional network and find
Yep.
talent themselves at a cheaper markup.
Yep.
There's this sense of, well, nobody knows my space better than I do. So there's just a lot of self-sourcing happening, more so than I've seen in the past. Now, the issue with that and the issue with sort of this quick increase and pivot to self-sourcing is the lack of oversight and governance that is really critical to running a low risk, low cost program. And what I mean by that is we find managers talking rates directly with candidates without any benchmarks or data for comparison. We find an inconsistent candidate experience depending on which manager they actually spoke to. We have components of those discussions at times kind of crossing certain boundaries from a co-employment standpoint.
Yes.
And so what I found is this leads to not only increased risk, but believe it or not, costs that are way above market, even despite the lower EOR markup, right? Which kind of defeats the whole purpose of doing this model. So to your point and your question around like what we're seeing with EOR is I think that a pivot towards EOR can work. And I think it can be successful if the program itself is one, engaging with the business early and providing those benchmarks, making sure that they are known as the source of data. And two, providing the resources to sort of assist with that self-sourcing process, right? Avoiding, helping that manager to avoid like misinformation or overshare and really keep those discussions more controlled and that candidate experience more consistent. So I think EOR is a viable model. Personally, I tend to steer towards the agencies because I just don't think that a lot of programs are fully set up to govern that in a way that keeps costs down and keeps the process controlled enough. But you've got things like direct sourcing and all these other channels out there that I think can be really, really good tools to kind of help establish some governance over manager self-sourcing.
Well said, and I think a critical point, because what you described during the Zerpa era, I experienced as well. We called it, as we were planning the podcast, the wild west of staffing. I mean, it really was. And if you were in tech and in specifically contingent worker programs or people and talent, it was growth, just breakneck growth. It was like, we can't grow fast enough. Contractors full time. It was just a sprint to growth. It was butt and seat. And often it wasn't driven by any business metric or unit economic like driver. It was just hiring because we needed to catch up and money was cheap. Well, now it's different. And so what we're seeing is a focus on prudence. And staffing programs and contingent workforce programs by design typically save an organization money. And just wanted to highlight, if you're tuning in and curious about why to expand or how to choose a vendor list, traditionally, the overhead cost by not paying the benefits, and then the stock typically for a public tech company is a huge component of the cost beyond the salary, is why folks might choose this in addition to the flexibility for the capacity model. And so that's often what we hear now. I wanted to touch on EOR and break it down again for the audience, from a simple how and why perspective before we get into the vendor specialization piece, because EOR feeds into that. I think actually some staffing firms do specialize in EOR or have a division that can support that. And some folks choose to EOR directly with maybe a platform. And there's some big players in the space. But first, let's break this down. So let's talk just domestic, nothing offshore. Every country has its own labor laws. Some are very complex. So let's not go down that rabbit hole, but just domestically, we have payrolling and we have employer of record. And so break down when you're saying a hiring manager, let's take an example being a VP of engineering wants to find a contractor, a mobile engineer for a project. It's only going to be 3 months and he needs some help building some features. And he knows from his past role, he has some friends or alumni that might be a fit for this. And he wants to find someone to EOR on his own. What is employer of record and why might he go directly to that candidate from his own network than staffing? Just break down the story for us here.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, and I think this, like I said, if done well, it can work. It can work to the favor of the business, right? If you've already got that top talent in your network, that is your best source. Why go to the market and search the broad talent pool if you've already got somebody that you've worked with in the past, sort of this proven talent? Where the EOR model comes into play is, you purely just need somebody to represent that person's employment while they're going to be on assignment for you for that, let's say 2-3 months, whatever it is that you mentioned. And they're going to be the party that kind of serves as the intermediary to not only reduce costs, right? Because they are on a different set of rates. You're not giving them FTE equity. They're not on your full-time salary. So there is a lot of, at least in the US and the way things work, there's a lot of opportunity for sort of cost avoidance there, of course. And then the everything around benefits, around discussions with up-leveling their career, with, hey, I've got feedback about the manager. All of that overhead and all of that burden sits with that employer of record. So it really relieves a lot of what would otherwise sit with the business, that would otherwise sit with HR and other cross-functional partners. Your EOR is going to own all of that stuff. So for a fairly low markup, you're reducing costs and you're really reducing that burden. It could be a really great path.
Well said. And I think that's one of the reasons specifically we've seen the spike in payrolling and EOR in the people and talent space. Is what I'm hearing is folks at a public tech company can post a recruiter role and have 1,000 applicants filter through on their own and then payroll them, often through a staffing vendor or directly with a platform, a software that offers EOR. And there's many out there to investigate. But that's the use case here. If you're tuning in and wondering why we've seen that, that's kind of the why. A fun topic is the specialization piece. You touched on this in the beginning, and I think it's really important to understand how and why you choose your shortlist of vendors to be in your ecosystem of contingent workers. Who gets to join the program and why? And how do you, Patrick Hartwell, design the program with specialized vendors? Why is that important?
Yeah. So I think in a lot of cases, and honestly, even myself in the past, I think a lot of folks would be quick to defer sort of solely to the recommendations of their MSP. Like, hey, you guys are the service provider. What suppliers are working well at your other clients? I think that really leaves out a really important piece of the whole equation, which is the business that you're actually supporting, right? So I think while it's certainly not a bad thing to turn to your MSP for advice, right? That's what you're paying them for. When you're building a more specialized set of suppliers, rather than just bringing in temp agencies, it's really important to lean on the business for their expertise, and partner with them on a truly shared strategy, even to the point of setting up weekly syncs with leaders of those different functions. Like I said, the goal there is keeping them involved, and identifying true talent gaps from their mouth to yours, right? Like rather than trying to sort of do any guesswork. All of this really sets the stage to start working together in this sort of, well, I'll just call mini RFP format.
Yeah.
And I've seen this work already, where you take the time to meet with a number of potential staffing firms, you give the business a chance to ask their technical questions, of course, while your CW program team, vets them from more of that delivery standpoint, and starts to vet their cost models and things like that. From there, you take the time to debrief together, you discuss your selection from there, and you're able to sort of onboard a new supplier in that way. Now, I've just described an RFP, right? So for those of you familiar with the process, this is not new. Again, not a revolutionary thing, but what I found is this is used all the time on the outsourcing vendor side. But, when with an established staff aug program under an MSP, there is no, maybe from when the program first goes live, but apart from that, you're kind of optimizing out, you're adding onesies and twosies here and
Yep.
there, but
Yep.
you're not doing this formal process. And I think this needs to be an ongoing thing.
Yes.
Where you're saying, hey, these 5 suppliers over the last year didn't meet the mark. We now have this gap. I'm not going to just go pick whatever the first recommendation is. I want to properly vet it. I want the business to be involved,
And buy in.
so we can vet them and everything. So I found not only does that deliver on what you're trying to do, right, by bringing in the more strategic agencies, but just your rapport with the business internally. You as your CW program become much more credible. You are now seen as the subject matter expert. You're seen as a real partner rather than just kind of an order taker. So I think there's just so much value there in keeping the business engaged. Now, again, we want to strike a balance there, right? You don't want to overburden them with supply-based management, but you want to keep them engaged enough such that they feel they have a say in who's actually coming into the program.
So I'm excited to unpack this a little more because I've personally spent time at vendors that are big and small. Some might use the term mom and pop or maybe boutique, and these phrases typically apply to a staffing agency or a vendor that has sometimes 2 to 200 employees at the staffing company. It's smaller. There's large public staffing companies, or not public, they're private, but they're multi-billion dollar, multi-thousand, multi-region vendors. And there's trade-offs on why one might choose each vendor. But tell us a bit about what do you specifically mean by specialization, and what kinds of roles, or let's call it orgs within a company, might most benefit from a specialized vendor? And then where do you kind of look for on the spectrum of mom and pop and large scale? Who fits best for those specialized?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, like we've been discussing, right? We're no longer in this environment that is primarily focused on volume and speed. Instead, we're really looking for that top talent, even if it takes a little longer to find.
Yes.
Because we may not have the budget for more heads anytime soon. So we kind of want to do it right the first time. And in this type of landscape, the giant multinational temp agency that you've described, I think, aren't always really set up to deliver it in that same way compared to these niche firms that are really well networked in sort of specific talent communities that spend the time going to the local meetups, building those relationships, and that maintain a truly curated talent pipeline rather than just kind of a list of names in the ATS that you label as your pipeline, but is it really?
Yeah.
This sort of elevated model, that admittedly requires more skilled, more senior recruiters, I think, really tends to show that it can outperform your sort of major global agencies of years past. Now, to your question around which orgs is this most pertinent for, I would say anything that's in the tech space or in the creative areas, right? So you think about your engineering, your product development, all those types of teams, and then you look at marketing, creative, who's actually building the material to sell your product or sell your app, whatever that might be. That requires real, sort of, like I said, curated talent. It requires, sort of a niche sort of skill set. And that's not to discount any other skill sets, right? If you're an HR, or you're an administrative skill set or whatever that might be, or something that we may call non-technical,
G&A. Yeah.
it doesn't mean that a specialized firm can't also identify that talent. I mean, there's niche roles in finance as well, right? But I think as far as for a whole org, your temp agency is not going to be able to deliver for a truly sort of robust engineering organization, or generally not going to be able to deliver that top talent for your marketing team. So that's kind of the areas that I focus on more when I think about specialization.
And then, when you're talking to, so the RFP process, or maybe just a vendor screening, explain for the talent leaders tuning in, maybe they're head of talent and they're partnering with a CW leader right now, and they want to revitalize their vendor list. Do you have a short list of questions or creative probing questions that you ask vendors that maybe our audience here can, absorb from you today to scrutinize, screen, and then select the right specialized vendors? What do you ask them?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's two sides to this, right? And I mentioned this earlier. And one side is very much the business, and it's not just, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Manager, put together a list of questions and then let's meet, right? You're guiding them through that as well. So on the business side, you want to make sure that they're asking open-ended questions. They're inserting their technical expertise into that. Some of that stuff, above my head. But then on
Me
our
too.
side as well, from
Yeah.
the CW standpoint, a lot of it is focused on just like what does their delivery model look like. So I
Yeah.
think about things like how many for X volume, how many recruiters would you hypothetically assign to a program of this size? What do your recruiters do to stay well networked in their professional communities that they support? And then from the talent standpoint as well, right? Like, what do you do to constantly develop your pipeline talent or keep them engaged? Kind of what sets their agency apart. And then you think about the basics too, and it's important not to lose sight of those, right? What time zones are you supporting? What geographies are
Yeah.
you in?
Yeah.
With countries, or excuse me, with companies moving into all these different countries outside the US, you may find yourself sort of pigeonholed if you find an agency that only supports the US East Coast, right? But they don't have the ability to onboard in the UK, or they don't have a lot of talent sitting on the West Coast. That's not going to work very well. So you kind of need to think long term. I like to always ask, even if we're not doing that right away, I like to ask, hey, what are the other countries you're operating in? Because maybe we'll expand it another year or two, depending
Totally.
on what we need.
Totally. Yeah, the footprint is important. I mean, you touched on some really good questions. I think, at the end of the day, data is very important, whether you're internal or external third party as the agency, to understand how you can align with the quality expectations. And so, if you're tuning in and maybe you're at a staffing agency and want to learn how to improve your performance, is be ready to tell a story with data. The funnel metrics are important. And you touched on one of those stats early on. It's not just offer acceptance rates, but even top of funnel, what are your pass through rates with other vendors, from a, say, hiring manager call to tech screen to offer, and really through the entire funnel metric, whether you're hiring engineers, product design, or even recruiters. So certainly, useful information there. And other questions I hear are like, what tools are you using to screen and select candidates? So maybe their tech stack. And another interesting thought is, after a contingent worker, a temp, a contractor is onboarded with the client, how do you manage that contractor? Is there a candidate care program, or do you just hire them and then never speak again? And I hear that a lot. And unfortunately, that's a reality, I think, of the lagging modernization of staffing companies. Is there often is a lag, whether it's an MSP or a mom and pop staffing firm, is often there is a lack in that modernizing workflow. And so that's one of the things I hear as well. And I don't know how
Mhm.
that resonates with you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you hit on a few points there that are all completely valid. Obviously, the tangible stuff like the data, I will often ask for client references. So if they say, oh, yeah, we've got a huge program we're supplying at, tech company XYZ, great. Well, can you put us in touch with a manager there who might be able to speak to, how successful that's been? That is not like outside, you're not crossing any boundaries by asking for that kind of info. And absolutely, the candidate experience is so important. There's a real risk of, high turnover, right? If the agency isn't
Attrition.
supporting its talent. And unfortunately, and kind of by design, you as the client, right? You can't do a ton in terms of retention. I mean, you can keep people bought into the work they're doing, but there are boundaries that are in place that exist to avoid, sort of this co-employment scenario. So it really does, that responsibility to truly keep folks engaged, to feel supported, doesn't necessarily sit with the client quite as much as it sits with the agency that you're onboarding. So that's absolutely, to your point, a critical part to ask.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think what it does is it ultimately creates the best candidate experience. And whether that candidate is technically on the payroll of the staffing firm or might be interested in moving full time, if it is contract to hire, to the client, it's still very important to focus on the candidate experience and the client experience. And I think one of the best ways to do that is just clear communication. And so tuning into one of the words you used at the beginning of the show today is the the operations, the process. And this really is a process heavy industry. And the more refinement that you can bring to the process, for whether it's your staffing firms or within your MSP or internally, in a CW program or talent team, is refine those processes. And so one of the things, so it's funny, we're talking about, these are trends, basically. These are trends in the CW space. And gosh, the talent, the tech industry year over year has changed so rapidly. And when I look at, it's end of January today, Patrick. I'm sure this will publish in a few weeks and it might be a different world then, but
Mhm.
it is changing so rapidly thanks to many factors, incoming administration changing, literally changing laws. stock market rallies, changing stock price and maybe causing some hiring sprees. Maybe VCs are loosening the wallet and making more large investments soon. We don't know what the landscape will be like a year from now. If we had a crystal ball, I'd love to look inside of it for a moment. And what do you think the tech industry and then specifically, CW programs will be like a year from now if we do our second show in 2026?
Yeah, absolutely. You really hit it. I think with the way things are going nowadays, it's really tough to make a prediction that I may not have to backpedal in a few months, right?
Yeah.
A few weeks, gosh. But I do think the tech market will see a continued focus on those core areas that I mentioned, right? You think about engineering, marketing, sales is another one, building the product and getting it sold. With potentially, and this is just kind of my perception, potentially a reduction in kind of those more back end operational functions. You see, your HR, finance, some of those other teams running a little bit more lean than they have historically, while companies look to sort of allocate more budget to the money making, aspects of their product, right?
Agreed.
And I think this is now going to be married up with all the uncertainty with, again, tightening budgets. You're not going to have as much FTE headcount. So I do think we'll see, whenever this sort of environment presents itself, we'll see an uptick in just overall volume and requests for contractors, maybe more so than in previous years. Now, the potential conflict, right, is you've got these two competing themes up against each other. If you've got a supply base that isn't fully specialized and isn't ready to source this competitive talent market, but now you've got this incoming slew of recs because the business needs this flexible model, your program is going to need to be set up to deliver that top talent in a way that's not, throwing 100 resumes at the manager and seeing what sticks.
Yeah.
So again, with the focus on, some of those niche groups, engineering, marketing, et cetera, especially, you're really going to need to make sure that your agencies can deliver against that. And I think that's where that specialization that we've been talking about is really going to come into play. And it doesn't need to be, right, like, let's say we've only got a year to do this. It doesn't need to mean you overhaul your entire supply base. Maybe onboard one, take half of a year to vet some agencies, onboard one supplier, and you'd be surprised what a difference that can make if you've got any particular category that's maybe underperforming.
Yeah, good answer. And I think I agree with the demand. I agree there are signals that demand will increase both for full-time headcount, but especially and even more so in volume of temps, contractors, contingent workers. And I'm going to take a stab here at an esoteric topic that I think will change what we do. And I think AI will build tools at a rate that's faster than they can even be adopted in our industry. And the little signals I'm seeing are that AI agents have the potential to increase efficiency in our programs, in our worlds. And I think that the staffing firms and the contingent worker or people and talent teams internally that adopt appropriate AI ecosystems will become very efficient, and those that don't adopt will fall behind. That's kind of my prediction. And I'm already seeing it, with tools like Juicebox for sourcing. It's incredibly efficient. And there's some scheduling. I'm seeing increases in efficiency with scheduling and interview summarization too. There's some really cool tools in that space. And so I think what we're going to see, and then even OpenAI announced, I think they're calling it literally an agent. I don't know what the product feature will be called, but Anthropic has an agent that they're going to be releasing. They just talked about this. And if you're tuning in and curious what that means, you can give this agent tasks and it can, in a separate window, essentially run a series of tasks for you. And that might mean booking travel and coordinating an interview, or it might mean something related to maybe sourcing or scheduling or something in the ecosystem and life cycle of recruiting. So that's my prediction. Is I think that we will see efficiencies, not replacement of orgs, but efficiencies there. Of course, I don't know. This is my personal prediction, but I hope, and I want to send this positive vibe out to the tech, the talent, contingent worker industry, that we see an improvement, because just want to acknowledge it's been a tough time. The past couple of years has been a tough time. And I think I guess we're seeing light at the end of the tunnel, but for some looking for contract or full-time roles, it's still a tough time. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that piece, but that's what I still hear out on the LinkedIn feed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to touch on your sort of comments around AI.
Yeah.
I share in obviously, every discussion nowadays, if AI doesn't come up, what are you guys even talking about?
I had to throw it in there,
Right? No, but the one thing that I think, and this is just from my own perception and kind of what I've seen so far, is that the staffing industry, or personally, at least I hope so, won't won't be as quick to adopt AI as other industries are. So for the task-based things that you described, interview scheduling and all that stuff, I think that's fine. But we have this outstanding problem that I have not really read about any major solutions to, which is this inherent bias that is built into
Yeah.
all of these AI tools. And so, especially with, we've got a divergence in the new landscape now today. We've got some companies that are really double down and fully embracing their D&I approach, right? And then you've got some companies that are kind of moving away from that. And I think those two same buckets will be the companies that are more averse to implementing AI solutions into their staffing at the
Yep.
risk of sort of that inherent bias when it comes
Yep.
to candidate selection and stack
Yep.
ranking versus companies that are going to be very quick to adopt it. And I think may face some backlash with, hey, a lot of folks that maybe weren't selected that were either better qualified or maybe they come from a certain background and the AI sort of filtered them out. I think we're going to hear a lot about that. Personally, from my own standpoint, I want to avoid that latter bucket. I'd like to not be the guinea pig in this whole AI space, especially with something as sensitive and as impactful to someone's livelihood, right? As staffing. So really, yeah, just a really interesting space. I know I think I pivoted a little bit from your question. You talked about AI, but then I want to make sure I answered your full question if you could repeat it.
A very appropriate comment to say the DEIB space has changed dramatically. I just talked about this topic in a previous episode. Check it out, where we honed in on the word belonging and what that means and how DEI programs are in some companies evolving into this sense of belonging. And you're totally right. It is becoming bifurcated, a lot of that driven or the catalyst being the incoming administration. So I think it's important. That's why I love this show. And I'm grateful you brought it up, as we can have open and honest conversations about where we're at today in the tech industry, what we can do as talent and CW leaders to prepare our teams internally and externally to be aware and then adopt the right practices. So thanks for bringing that up. And then certainly AI, no one wants to be the guinea pig and get in hot water there. So I think there's still some, what word would you use, trepidation or maybe a cautious approach to finding the right tools that aren't biased.
Exactly. Yep.
Well said, Patrick. Well, I want to thank you again for joining the show. I've learned a lot in chatting with you. I've had a lot of fun, and I hope our audience did too. So thanks for tuning in. Any parting words for our audience before we check out?
No, no, I really appreciate the thoughtful discussion. I think it's been great to chat. So yeah, happy to ever meet again if you ever wanted to in the future.
Well, awesome. Thanks for joining the Lean In podcast and have a great day. Bye,
You as well.
everyone.